a flight to catch. So it gives me great joy to present Keshava Guha, a young debutante novelist. Keshava is a writer of fiction and literary and political journalism. His debut novel, Accidental Magic, is set in Boston in the early 2000s, and that's the book he's going to be talking about with Sandeep Roy, a novelist and journalist whose first novel, Don't Let Him Know, won him the honor title for the Asia Pacific American Literature Awards. So, without much ado, over to both of you.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for being here and congratulations on the book, Keshava. Um, yeah. And for those who want their books signed by T.M. Krishna, he's signing in the bookstore near the East Gate. Um, hey, you can stay and listen to this too. Um, this is a horrible thing when you're driving away your own audience. But for many people who don't know what this book, Accidental Magic, is about, I'll just read the one line in the description so you get a little bit of context of where this conversation is going. And it says, set in Boston and Bangalore, Accidental Magic is the story of four very different people whose lives are brought together by Harry Potter. And it's such a brilliant idea that you think like, oh my God, why hasn't somebody already written this story before? Because Harry Potter has touched such disparate people in so many ways. But for this purpose of this, we need to start at the very beginning, which is the obvious question, which I'm sure you always get, as to what was your relationship with Harry Potter?
So, thanks, Sandeep. I think that, if you look at the people who love Harry Potter, you could broadly divide them into two categories. So there are people who love books and happen to love Harry Potter, and there are people who love Harry Potter and may not have a strong relationship with books in general, right? So I was definitely in the first category. I mean, I wouldn't say that Harry Potter was my favorite book, for example. It was one of the many books that I loved growing up. What was special about Harry Potter was that it was something shared, right? So, literature is a private activity. I mean, reading and writing. One of the interesting things about literary festivals is that, with a music festival, it's you're just consuming music in a different form. At a literary festival, it's completely different from the actual experience of consuming literature, which is a silent, as I said, private activity. Uh, Harry Potter was something that I guess my generation shared, right? So I was, I should just stay at the very outset because this is I'll say it now so there's no confusion later. This is not a book about Harry Potter, right? And it's been out a couple of months now, and so I've had reactions from a lot of readers. And the most interesting thing for me has been that the people who have taken to this book most have been, on average, older, or 40s, 50s, 60s, and often people with no relationship to Harry Potter, never even read Harry Potter. And conversely, there have been some younger readers who love Harry Potter, who maybe are in that category where they love Harry Potter but not books in general, who've said, but we thought we were going to we're getting a book about Harry Potter, or we thought we were going to getting a new Harry Potter, and turns out they weren't getting either of those things, right? Uh, so let me just say two more things about my relationship with Harry Potter. The first is that, like two of the main characters in this book, who I'm sure we'll say more about later, I was as a child I was sort of a bit of a misfit. I didn't have a very easy time relating to or connecting with my peers, and I sort of preferred the company of my parents and grandparents and that kind of thing, and books, right? And Harry Potter, when I discovered it, when we all discovered it, it was the first thing that I really shared with my peers. So when I was 9, 10, 11 years old, uh, that was one thing that every child in my class cared about. The other thing is that, so the book is set in the early 2000s, and the reason for that is that Harry Potter exploded as a global phenomenon in the years 1999 and 2000, and Harry Potter online fandom had its peak in that period. Partly because this is a pre-social media era, so it's the early fan communities, right? Which were, for those of you who remember them, like they were. The internet seemed like a very civilized, optimistic, congenial place, right? It seems crazy to people who are maybe under 20 today to think about, but that's really what it was like. And the internet was not at that point not controlled by corporations who were basically hoarding your data in order to hawk you to advertisers. And when I discovered Harry Potter, I was also discovering the internet. And I learned that there were these adult Harry Potter fan communities. Now, I already said I didn't relate very easily to my peers. So I discovered that through Harry Potter, I could have access to this world of grown-ups, right? So in these fan groups, I was 9, 10, 11 years old. Everybody else was in their 20s upwards, up through their 70s or 80s, right? And the conversation was at an adult level. And I wanted to be part of that.
So in these fan groups, did you have to pretend to be over 16 or something?
No, well, the thing is, I was more of a consumer of these fan groups. I didn't post very often. I was what they call a lurker. I think a word that people still use. But it was more, I just felt that I was part of this grown-up chat about something that I cared about, and miraculously these grown-ups also cared about. Yeah.
Well, one of the things you say is this is set in around 1999, 2000, in that time frame. And maybe you could also explain why this fandom was at its peak right then, because all the Harry Potter books have not yet come out. So this is a very special moment.
It's a good question. Partly that's when the Harry Potter became a phenomenon very quickly. So the first Harry Potter book came out in 97. But it's only in 99 that it suddenly takes off, right? Partly it's this is the peak of fandom because it's the initial enthusiasm, right? So partly also it's because J.K. Rowling was writing a book a year, 97, 98, 99, 2000. The book that came out in 2000, Goblet of Fire, really raised the stakes. It was much more serious, a bit more grown up. And then she took a break. And that break, so it's like the analogy I use in the book is that Harry Potter was an addiction, right, for people. So if you're addicted and she's not coming out with a new book, you need a different way to get your fix. And so that 3 years between 2000 and 2003 is when most of the fan fiction was written, because that's when you needed fan fiction or fan discussion as a way to get through the day until the next book.
And you didn't know when the next book was coming
exactly.
out.
And the last point I'll make is about 9/11, right? So the Harry Potter is a pre-9/11 phenomenon because it comes from a world where everything was not political. Like, I really feel that today we're living in a time where we're teaching our young people, and when I mean people younger than 10, 12 years younger than myself, that there's no such thing as art, there's no such thing as ideas, there's just politics. And politics is about right versus wrong, good versus bad, Harry versus Voldemort. But there's the innocent pleasure that people could take in Harry Potter 20 years ago. We're not allowed to take that innocent pleasure in anything now, right? And we can argue about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I don't want to get into that. But it's just a fact. I mean, that it is the concept of art for pleasure, or even the concept of art as aesthetic in the first instance, and not political in the first instance, is not an option. It's not presented as an option anymore. So I don't think Harry Potter, and also it's pre-social media, it's pre the claims on our attention spans of Instagram and Twitter. Very specific set of conditions that produce this phenomenon.
That we necessarily didn't think about at that time because we were just living through them, and that changed. But in the book, you do allude to this fact that in 1841, Charles Dickens is writing the old Curiosity Shop, and when the ship comes to New York, hundreds of people throng the ship because they've been waiting for months to discover whether little Nell in Old Curiosity Shop had actually died or lived, and they had no way of knowing for months. But the point is that at that time, even while they were waiting, they didn't write their own fan fiction versions of Old Curiosity Shop to fill in that gap. This is something that was only possible now.
Yeah, and you know, we don't. I don't have an answer to why. Yeah, I mean, of course, the internet enabled people to disseminate their stories, but I actually think a lot of people wrote these stories because writing, as I said, it was a way of getting your fix, right? So you wrote your own Harry Potter fan fiction because you couldn't wait for the next book. And see, Dickens was sending a new chapter every month, at least, so it wasn't like waiting years.
Yeah. And in fact, to get to the novel, as you've rightly said, this is not a book about Harry Potter. Harry Potter is just sort of the excuse in a way. And not even Harry Potter. Yeah. It is the idea of Harry Potter and the fan world that springs up around Harry Potter that brings these people together. So, I want you to just introduce the 4 characters because, why don't you introduce them and then I'll ask them.
And let me also link them to why I wrote this book. So the book started as an idea with 2 of the characters. It did, so the 4 characters. So there's the 4 main characters: 2 Indians, 2 Americans. So let's start with one of the Indians and one of the Americans. So the closest thing this book has to a protagonist is a young man called Kannan, and he's a Tamil, and so I mean his full name is C. Kannan because we don't generally have surnames in the South. And he goes to the US in his early 20s to study computer science at Northeastern University. And he is following unwillingly and imperfectly in the footsteps of an older brother who is more academically successful, more driven, fairer skinned, and thus, Kannan is seen as, it's almost like it's the family kind of implicitly. There was a session about Woodhouse, and one of Woodhouse's most famous jokes. I mean, I don't remember it exactly, but it's about he contrasts. He looks at how he compares the male codfish to the English aristocrat, and he talks about how the male codfish loves all his children equally, despite having 3 million of them or whatever. But the English aristocrat has never managed to have the same attitude towards younger sons, right? So Kannan is an
Prince Harry.
Yeah. So Kannan is an unloved and unwanted younger son. So he goes to the US because his brother had gone to the US, and he arrives in the US, and his brother has written this very condescending letter, full of instructions on how he's supposed to go about his business in the US. And one of the amazing discoveries after I wrote this book was that someone, a well-known Indian novelist whom I won't name, wrote to me and said that when I got to the US and I was 20 years old, I had a letter waiting there for me by my condescending older brother. And your letter, what you describe in the book is almost word for word what my brother wrote to me. So there are obviously older brothers like this. And he goes to the US and and I think that in inversion of the trope of loneliness, he's just thrilled to be on his own initially, to be away from his family, to have space for the first time in his life. And then later on, there comes a point in which this aloneness, as he thinks of it, becomes a bit extreme, and that's when he discovers Harry Potter. So that's Kannan. Then you've got at the other end of the spectrum, age-wise and background-wise, a man called Curtis Grimmett, usually in the book referred to by his surname, Grimmett, who is in his mid-50s. And he hosts a weekly public radio show in Boston. But he's like Kannan in some ways, in that he is lonely. He is a bit of a social misfit. He doesn't have close human relationships. And just to refer back to something I said earlier, Grimmett is someone who is a lover of books who happens to love Harry Potter. Kannan is someone who, self-confessedly, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone is the first book he's read in his life. Because if you grow up as Kannan comes from the same community I do, but in many families, if you grow up in a kind of Brahmin family in the South, you're meant to study engineering. you might never encounter a novel. I mean, you might have read a comic books, but you're meant to read your science textbooks. You're not supposed to waste your time reading what some people call storybooks. It's
Otherwise, you read the Vikas General Knowledge Refresher.
yeah, yeah, and fiction is something that was earlier seen as something that women read, and is now seen as something that nobody should waste their time with, right? That's Kannan. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone is the first book he reads, and he's 24 or something when he reads it. But for Grimmett, who he's a well-read person. He's an Anglophile and comes to Harry Potter through that. And then there are two women among the four main characters. Again, one Indian, one American. In this case, both young. So Rebecca has just graduated. Rebecca Nichols, she's just graduated from college when the book opens. Like Curtis Grimmett, she's an Anglophile. She's sort of comes from a liberal intellectual family. Her father's an academic. But she is, unlike Grimmett and Kannan, she's not a social misfit. She's someone who's quite well-adjusted and, happy. But she's going through a little bit of a, post-college crisis about looking for meaning in her life, you could say. And she comes to Harry Potter,
Literally just wants to curl up with Harry Potter at night because
Yeah,
other parts of her life were in bit
yeah,
of a shambles.
exactly. She's sort of just realized that she's not happy with her life choices, and finally you have another young woman called Malti. Malti is she's about 20 when the book starts, and she's doing her MA in English at Stella Maris College at Madras. And for much of the action of the book, she's in Madras. So the book is set in Boston. 3 of the characters are in Boston. Then you've got Malti in Madras. Harry Potter was an Indian phenomenon as well. Malti has had a difficult childhood in that she's lost her mother when she's 11 or 12. And she's someone I think of great resilience. Again, like Rebecca, you wouldn't say that Malti is a misfit. She's also a lover of books. And this is fairly early on in the book, so I'm not ruining any plot secrets here. Malti and Kannan have an arranged marriage, which is what brings her into contact with the other 3 characters, and what eventually brings her over to Boston and kind of completes the set.
Yeah, and one of the points of contact with this guy she doesn't know at all is the fact that they both enjoy Harry Potter.
So let me briefly tell that story. So Kannan doesn't want to get married. But he also has a hard time saying no to his brother. His brother sends him an email one day saying, "A good match has been found for you. I've bought your tickets. You're flying to Bangalore next week." And this is sort of how Kannan's life generally goes, right? And it also occurs to him that it's a bit odd that his match should be arranged before his brother's, because his brother is older. Turns out there are probably quite good reasons why his brother's matched. Well, his brother doesn't want a match to be arranged for himself. He goes to Bangalore. He's determined to reject this young woman before meeting her. And then when they go for a walk in a place called Cubbon Park, which anyone who's been to Bangalore will be familiar with. And because she loves books, she asks him, they can't look at each other, they can't exchange a word. And then she says to him at some point, "Do you read books?" And 2 years previously, the question would be no. But he says, "No, yes, I love Harry Potter." And a couple of hours later, I think they both feel like they could make a go of this. Yeah, I won't say anything more about that, but that's certainly how things start off.
It's their philosopher's stone between them.
Yeah.
But it's interesting when you talk about this, because I was thinking that in many ways, my own journey to the US was not so, minus the condescending older brother, was not so different for Kannan's. I was this engineering student in a small town and all of in the US. And I could relate to a lot of what you say in the book about that conflict, or rather that contrast between aloneness and loneliness, where in a way, it is thrilling to be somewhere where nobody knows you anymore and nobody's watching. You come home whatever time you like and nobody cares, and nobody's emotional guilt tripping you for having not eaten your dinner. But because of this particular time when Kannan is there, he experiences all this, but he's also seeing an online community he can plug in. So this is that his slice of the story is an immigrant story, but it's a different kind of immigrant story than we're used to. And even though you say that the two women and are not misfits, they are slightly misfits in their own way in the kind of society, what society expects of them. So would it be wrong to call this a sort of novel of morals and manners for misfits?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, that's sort of how I ended up seeing it. It's people are looking for belonging. They're looking for community, looking for meaning. You could say, sometimes finding it, maybe more often than not finding it. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I would just say that there's a difference between Malti and the other three. I think the other three have a strong implicit or explicit sense that they're not happy with the way their lives are currently. Sometimes, I mean, Rebecca, probably because she's more articulate, voices it better than the others do. I think Malsi is someone who just lives in the world. She has things that she cares about, but more than that, she is understand. I think one of the consequences of losing her mother at this young age is just an understanding that she has to react to what happens in life, and things are not going to be she can't take things for granted, and all of that. And she just has an openness towards the future, right? So I don't know about her being but you're certainly right that she is. Look, I mean, it's a generational difference, right? But like I did think about when I was sort of rereading my own first draft of the book, I thought about my grandmother, right? My mother's mother, who was definitely somebody whose intellectual ambitions were frustrated because she was a young woman in India in the 1950s, where you weren't supposed to have those kinds of ambitions. And, you know, things have improved by Malti's time. But yeah, I mean, Malti shouldn't be having to be made to have an arranged marriage when she's 20 to Kannan. She's a top student at Stella Maris. And so she's also someone that's true. There is a mismatch between, you could argue, between her potential, her capabilities, and the situations that she's thrust into. Yeah.
So what attracted you about, you know, what this online world could do in bringing such disparate people together and the way it fills in the gaps?
I think partly what you just said, the word disparate. So, you know, everyone knows America's diverse on paper. There's, you know, you could look at a place like Queens in New York City, and it's the most diverse place on earth in terms of ethnicity. But people tend to cluster with other people like themselves. You know, it wasn't always like this necessarily. It was always like this racially. But for example, people who've been to elite colleges tend to only know other people who've been to elite colleges, tend to only marry other people from elite colleges. Famously now, people tend to not know people of opposing political views. And most interestingly to me, this is just my own something that I'm drawn to as a topic. People tend to not form intergenerational relationships or friendships. So what I knew about the Harry Potter world was it was like the ship in Moby Dick, the Pequod. It was actually a home for everybody, right? For all kinds. And but in its sort of 21st century avatar, that meant there were people who were 18 and there were people who were 75. There were people who were clearly elite intellectuals, and there were people who were there was a young black woman sort of trying to first generation college, or make it a trying to be a school teacher. There were people. There was a man. There would be somebody who was a postman. You know, so it had that democratic quality.
It did, and I'm just going to interrupt you. But unlike our social media right now, where I can see in social media what you look like and what I look like and who is older and who is not, here these were just names, made up names.
So at one point in the book, Rebecca makes the observation. She's thinking that Curtis Grimmett is one of the only people she's encountered in the entire community whose username is his real name. but everybody else has a made-up name, right? And you initially, at least, you think of these people by their name, and the made-up names almost always conceal these biographical facts of gender or ethnicity or age or class or whatever.
And so when these people sort of come together, when you were looking at that world, what were the great schisms and fights that would rage through?
Yeah, so
the
the one that's referred to in the book, and again, younger Harry Potter fans have written to me saying, why have you written about this? Nobody cares. Well, in 2000, that's all they cared about. So after the fourth book of Harry Potter, the great debate among fans was about romance. It was, are Ron and Hermione going to get together, or are Harry and Hermione going to get together? And because it was kind of obvious that Ron and Hermione were going to get together, the second layer of the debate was, is this a good thing or a bad thing, right? And
and these were called ships, from
yeah,
relationships.
ships. So, yeah, ships, exactly. And so they were called ships, and they had names like HMS this or USS this, right? So in this case, the Harry Hermione was called HMS Pumpkin Pie, right? J.K. Rowling, a couple of years ago, came out and said, yes, Ron and Hermione got together, but I screwed up there. It shouldn't have happened. So it was a very belated and rather insufficient bit of solace to those who had always felt that way.
Do we have any sense of how J.K. Rowling herself reacted to this fan world?
You know, she had a very pragmatic and I think sensible approach of, encouraging it, right? But she didn't get too involved. But I think she probably quite smartly saw that. So the counter example is the famous American horror writer Anne Rice, right? Of the vampire interview with a vampire and all that. Anne Rice said you can't write fan fiction. I'm not allowing it. So you could not write Anne Rice fan fiction and upload it to a website. She would have it taken down. You'd get you got a letter from her lawyer if you did that. And that's just daft, right? I mean, people aren't going to buy fewer Anne Rice novels because yeah. So. So with J.K. Rowling, I think she understood that actually her books were benefiting from all of this, and she gotten herself into trouble. So the 2003 when Order of the Phoenix came out, she gave an interview to a couple of prominent Harry Potter fans, and they asked her, "What do you think about this whole thing?" And she basically said, "Look, I've dropped some pretty big hints about what's going to happen, and I don't really understand why you're still having this debate." People got very angry when she said that. So she didn't intervene after that for a long time.
Well, when you talk about the relationships, Harry and Hermione or Ron and Hermione, what you have in the book, it's very funny because you say the fan base is in denial about the fact that Harry Potter is in love not with his white English best friend, but a Chinese girl.
Look, sometimes this is a little joke I have because of when the book is set. So Harry Potter ends up getting together with his best friend Ron Weasley's sister, right? But at the time when my book is set, the only women he showed any interest in were an Indian girl and a Chinese girl. So one of my characters, who's Chinese American herself, says, "Look, these white fans want to pair him off with a white girl. He's not interested in white girls."
he's like a geeky. He's like a Mark Zuckerberg or somebody like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
But in that, when you look at how this fandom is filling in the gaps, there's all kinds of fan fiction that sprang up. There's queering fan fiction, where it imagines this torrid affair between Harry Potter and Malfoy and all of that. Did you yourself ever try your hand at writing fan fiction?
I wrote one or two things. They survive on the internet under a pseudonym. But I
was
was
not going to reveal.
No. But I was more interested in reading fan fiction than in writing it. But also, as I said before, Harry Potter was neither my first nor my greatest love in terms of books, and I was sort of spending most of my time reading other books, right? And then trying to write my own stories that were not fan fiction. So no.
And but in what you'd read, was fan fiction still very much set in that world of Hogwarts, or would you see no?
Right. So the fan fiction I was interested in reading was not set in Hogwarts at all. I was only interested in fan fiction about Harry, Ron, and Hermione as grown-ups, right? And so by and large, grown-up fans wrote these stories because these are people who they were interested in the stuff of most conventional fiction, right? Which is relationships and friendships and sadness and family and so they brought those, or for that matter, there were people who wrote thrillers like but like grown up thrillers. So anyway, so they brought their own interests to Harry. In a way, they were there were a couple. I think these were people with literary ambitions, and they were trying their writing skills out in a way, using Harry Potter as a canvas, and it meant that they had a guaranteed audience. It meant they didn't have to do the work of some of the work of world building, so, you could say. And at least two of them who were known in their pseudonyms were Cassandra Clare and Maya. And Cassandra Clare has used that pseudonym in her own novels. Maya, I don't know what her I forget what her name is, real name is. They became really successful young adult sort of sci-fi fantasy writers, and they got their start writing fan fiction. And that was how they learned that people would like their work, right? And they had something that readers reacted to. And the most famous example, of course, as many of you will know, although it's not from Harry Potter, is E.L. James, whose novels, whose Twilight series started out, whose 50 Shades of Grey started out as Twilight fan fiction. Yeah. And was then refashioned as an original novel.
You yourself have been and are review books, and I'm wondering like how you view this act of the lonely book reviewer who is such like that expert, or supposedly you've been given this book, and what is your thought, and versus then this online community of fan fiction who are both writing and in a way reviewing at the same time, because all these common threads are coming out.
So yeah, I mean, in India. So I was not. I'll emphasize. I reviewed books. I was never a literary critic, because actually literary criticism is a perfectly dignified and noble profession, right?
As opposed to reviewing books.
No, let me say what I mean. I just think that in India we have not created a hospitable environment for criticism, right? So book reviewing is, very few people review books as a full-time or even substantially full-time occupation, right? Which I think, when I look at, so one of the reasons why I stopped reviewing books is I was really, at best, competent. I mean, and probably really just mediocre. And I knew that, right? And I knew it because I read the work of properly good, if you think of Parul Sehgal in the New York Times or Michael Gora, properly good critics. And I was absolutely certain that I was never going to be anywhere close to that. And so I stopped doing it. But I think in India, that kind of proper criticism, I think it has to be done. You need to put in the hours. You need to develop a way of doing it, a system of doing it. And most of our reviewers just don't have that opportunity, right? So the reason I say all this is I think that the distinction between the reviewer in the newspaper and the reviewer on Goodreads is collapsing, frankly. And for better or worse. I mean, and also it's because in India, reviewers do not have the opportunity to build up that kind of credibility. That you don't the way that one of my teachers actually, James Wood, right, to choose an example of a famous critic. There are many writers whose careers have been made, Elena Ferrante in the US, Teju Cole, Zia Heather Rahman, Joseph O'Neill, by one review of his in the New Yorker, right? There's nobody in India who can make or unmake, frankly, a career because they haven't had the opportunity to build up that kind of body of work.
And what is sort of interesting now, and I'd love you to hear your thoughts on that, is if you look at fandom now and what it is, that in this age of TikTok and all of this, the distance between the producer and the creator and the fan is shrinking and shrinking ever so much, and people are themselves both the critic and the fan and the producer of that content.
I mean, I do. It strikes me as being not ideal for fiction, right? Which is, I don't think fiction thrives in, and I this is old. The people will say, well, storytelling will thrive in a new form, and of course it will, right? But I think there's something about prose fiction, about the novel, that will be something very meaningful, valuable that will be lost if other things will be gained by other forms of storytelling by all of this. But uh, I switch so much. I just yeah, space. We're being squeezed for space in every possible from every possible direction, right? I don't. I sort of I was off Twitter. I was sort of had to kind of I got back on it because I was going to be doing book events and I had to do all that kind of thing. But it's I after next month when I get back to writing my next book, I think I'm going to try to insulate myself as far as possible from all the from all this. I mean, look, the nicest part is you get emails from readers who have read the book with extraordinary care and. But I noticed very early on. I noticed that so many of those really thoughtful and insightful emails are from people who are over 40, over 50, who aren't on social media and are still reading in that way, right? They're still making the space for that kind of reading, and I mean, I don't think that all of this loss is irrevocable, but I have to say it is worrying.
Yeah, because in a way, even when you look at our relationship with fandom right now and the way it has intersected with nationalism and like what is a fan, whether you're fans of a writer or a sports star or the prime minister, all that fandom and that the fan world that you describe in this book and their conflicts, it does seem a very innocent world at that time, where a much more utopian world than this. I wanted to open this up for questions because Keshav also has a flight to catch, so I wanted to get in a couple of questions before that. So if you wave your hand, we will get a mic to you. I think there's a question right up front here.
Yeah, it was really a
If
very.
you could hold it up a little.
Okay. I really enjoyed the session. I would like to ask a question that you said this novel is set in the pre-social media time. So how different the experience would be if it's set in the contemporary time? How different?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So was everybody able to hear the question? Yeah. So it wouldn't be possible, and the difference between pre-social media and post, as I see it, is about communities. So I think that the actually social media internet is much more atomized, and it's this is the world of communities was one where they were quite small, they were quite enclosed. So there's a Yahoo group that I read about in the book. It's called Harry Potter for Big Kids, right? So they call themselves big kids because they're adults. It's maybe a few hundred people, and it feels private. I don't think they feel like they're exposing themselves, and above all, it actually has a slightly calming effect. There's a way, the way in which social media is designed to raise your blood pressure.
No.
I mean, either to make you angry or to make you excited in some form, right? But it's just not meant to be calming and or comforting. Comfort, yeah. These communities were comforting. You felt like, oh, I'm among these like-minded people. We all like each other. Our differences are kind of minor. It was, yeah.
How many people even remember Yahoo groups?
I know, right?
Somebody just messaged me that all these old Yahoo groups were being shut down and they were trying to archive all that content because there's all those conversations. There's a question here.
If somebody writes a fan fiction of your work, how do you react to that?
Wow. Well, firstly,
Are you going to be Anne Rice or J.K. Rowling?
Firstly, okay, so I'll say two things to that. Firstly, it's very unlikely because for obvious reasons when you read the book. But there's certain things that I think are a marker of success, right? So in India, you've really made it as a writer when your books are pirated and you see them on those pirated pavement stalls. That's really that that you've arrived. So maybe something similar is the case
You're
with
aspiring for that
fan-
first
with
before the
fan fiction. No, maybe fan fiction is in a way a version of that, except that it doesn't involve the loss of royalties. Yeah.
I think there's
Yeah, you made a passing reference on something. You said that today there is also a consideration at the matrimonial arena to look for people with similar political views. Now, my question is that as a writer, how do you visualize the impact of it in the society?
Great. So, a few things very quickly, but it's a really great question, I have to say. So, I was referring to the situation in the US, where there's a lot of survey data which shows that a substantial majority of Americans say that they would not be comfortable with their son or daughter dating, let alone marrying someone whose family supports the other party, right? So, and this is interesting because 70 or 80 years ago, party affiliations were not identities in this form. How does it affect society? I actually think it has an incredibly destructive effect on society. I think that, I think politics being reduced to a sport-like game of tribal loyalties and fandom is dangerous. Because, maybe if it's different in an overtly authoritarian system, but democracy does depend on conversation, right? And above all, I think democracy depends upon us having an idea that we have something that we share called citizenship, and that union of citizens overrides any other form of political loyalty. So I think it's very dangerous. And let me say one last thing on this. Look, I have sort of progressive social democratic views in politics, but it is a real problem that conservatives, there used to be conservative writers and artists, and go back 80 years to Europe, G.K. Chesterton, later Philip Larkin, Kingsley Amis. We still have a few in India, S.L. Bhairappa in Karnataka, but there's just, even between novelists, there's no conversation between the odd. If a novelist has had one good thing to say about the BJP, nobody wants to talk to him again. I just don't think this is at all healthy. And I think that the idea that we can only date or marry people of the same views is going to contribute to that.
I think we have time for probably one more question.
We can maybe have two if they're very quick. If they're very quick, I'll give quick answer.
And I'd like to take one from the back. Actually, can we take one from the back first? Someone from the back? Yeah.
Hello. My question is that you described...
Can you hold the mic up, please?
You described a situation where there was a lack of social media and there was a certain apoliticalness in the understanding of novels and literary works. In retrospect, would you not think that you had Harry Potter as an example, I'll take that. J.K. Rowling's certain problematic views have made fans of us, fans of Harry Potter, averse to have helped us understand that the novel series that she wrote was not in fact as inclusive as we would have thought it was.
Sure. I've got the question. Okay, very, very quick answer to this. Number one, it's not that it was an apolitical time earlier. The difference was politics was not the only way we spoke about literature. There were other ways also. Of course, politics is a very important lens to speak about literature, but it's not the only lens. And we're making it the only lens, and that's a problem. On your second point, again, very simple answer. My view on this is very simple. No person is perfect. No politician is perfect. No political party is perfect. No country is perfect. They never were perfect and they never will be. There will never be a morally perfect writer or a morally perfect novel. So let's stop looking for perfection from our books, from our writers, from our politicians. Let's accept that we're all humans. And it's just much healthier to appreciate a book in everything that is in it without looking for perfect inclusion, perfect politics.
I think one last question. Whoever can get the mic, you go.
See, India is culturally a very touchy country. Now, once I had seen a Hollywood movie, the dialogue went, please don't mind, Jesus dashing Christ. Dash was the 4-letter word. I was shocked. I didn't like it. But I thought this can happen in the United States. But then when Indian writers, any writer writes book revolving around the Indian culture, Indian society, then do you feel your hands are tied, or if you go overboard with expressions, what you feel like you can be heckled?
You're right. The historian Dharma Kumar used to call India a nation of grievance collectors, always looking to be offended at the first opportunity. What I discovered in this book, very briefly, is that there are a couple of points in which characters in the book express views that are maybe prejudiced, right? Or the fact that Kannan's parents prefer his brother because he's fairer-skinned. A couple of people wrote to me to say they are promoting racism. And that shocked me because I thought, well, if prejudice exists in society, it's going to be reflected in art, in characters in art. But more broadly, I was not really worried that this book would give offense. I think in the arts you have to just be willing to offend, because there's no otherwise you're not going to write anything interesting. I suspect if you're
probably not going to write anything
at all
because somebody will take offense.
Anyway, I have to go, but I want to say thank you, Sandeep. These are wonderful questions, and there are signed copies of my book available. I mean, I'd love to.
Signed.
I mean, I'd love to stay and chat with people, but unfortunately, I have to catch a flight. But thank you all so much.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.